My name is Arthur Pendleton, and I am 68 years old. For 35 years, I worked as a forensic auditor for the IRS. I spent my entire career dealing with numbers, ledgers, and grifters, making a living by looking people dead in the eye and uncovering doctored balance sheets. I used to think I had seen the absolute worst of human greed, and that retiring to my Texas ranch meant leaving those dark realities behind for good. I was wrong. The most chilling deception of my life was waiting for me right at my own son's dinner table. If you are listening to this right now, take a deep breath, because what I am about to share is a nightmare that no father should ever have to witness. Before we continue, please subscribe and turn on notifications, which helps me share this warning with more families. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from, as I read every single one. It was a typical July night in Texas. Even at 8 in the evening, the Austin heat felt like a furnace, but the air conditioning inside David's Westlake Hills mansion was cold enough to freeze your bones. It was a massive modern Tuscan villa, a loud statement of success and wealth, yet the air inside felt as heavy and still as a tomb. I sat at one end of the custom walnut dining table. To my right was Elena, my daughter-in-law. She looked flawless, her dark curls perfectly styled, wearing a silk and leather dress that cost more than my pickup truck. She was cutting into a medium-rare Wagyu steak with silver utensils, occasionally sipping a Napa Valley Cabernet, talking endlessly about a charity gala she was hosting at the country club. She looked exactly like a prominent socialite straight off a magazine cover. To my left sat my son, David. I raised him by myself after my wife passed away. He was one of Austin's top commercial real estate developers, holding a prime piece of downtown property inherited from his mother's family. But the man sitting next to me was not the David I knew. He had become a hollow shell, a ghost. David was only 42, but that night he looked 82. His skin was a sickly, waxy yellow, and his once sharp eyes were deeply sunken, framed by dark circles that looked like bruises. Instead of steak, he had nothing but a bowl of lukewarm oatmeal. His hands shook so violently that his spoon kept rattling against the ceramic bowl. Clink, clink, clink. Aside from Elena's voice, it was the only sound in the room. Elena suddenly dropped her fork onto her plate. The sound wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a whip. She told him that was enough and pointed out that he had messed up the table again. David winced, flinching away like a mistreated animal. In a weak, breathless voice, he apologized and said he couldn't control his hands. Underneath the table, my hands balled into fists. My auditor instincts were screaming that the numbers didn't add up. Just 3 months ago, David was kayaking down the Colorado River. Now he couldn't even hold a spoon? Elena let out a dramatic sigh, grabbing a napkin and leaning over to wipe David's mouth. Her movements were harsh, pushing his head back slightly. She told him how exhausting it was to watch him struggle, adding that the specialist brought in by a business associate insisted he just needed to focus, claiming his issues were entirely psychological. I couldn't sit through it anymore. I slammed my hand onto the table, making the wine glasses ring. I yelled at Elena to stop, pointing out how frail he had become. I insisted he needed to be in a hospital, not subjected to her lectures about focus. Elena froze. She turned her head slowly, looking at me with eyes like ice. There was no fear in them, only deep annoyance at being challenged. She addressed me by my first name, Arthur, rather than Dad, knowing exactly how much I disliked it. She claimed they had already discussed this and had the best private medical team in the state visiting daily. She argued his symptoms were just complications from a rare, early-onset neurodegenerative condition, adding that he was losing his grip on reality and suffering from severe paranoia. I turned to David, who was staring down at his oatmeal, as tears silently rolled down his pale cheeks. I gently asked him if what she was saying was true, and if he was really feeling anxious. David opened his mouth to speak, but Elena smoothly cut him off. She urged me not to agitate him, claiming he had already suffered an episode that morning where he failed to recognize her. She added that he had been shouting outside about people trying to take his land, calling the behavior embarrassing for the neighbors to hear. She took another sip of wine, using the crystal glass to hide the cold smirk on her face. Watching her swallow, my stomach turned. I had interrogated hundreds of tax evaders and fraudsters over the decades, and I knew exactly what a liar looked like. She was enjoying this, feeding off David's decline. At the far end of the table sat my 13-year-old granddaughter, Lily. She was usually a bright, energetic girl who loved talking about horseback riding and cheerleading. Tonight, she hadn't said a single word or touched her food. She wore an oversized hoodie with the hood pulled low, casting a dark shadow over her face. Her eyes darted anxiously between her parents and me, filled with pure terror. The atmosphere was suffocating. I pushed my plate away, my appetite completely gone. I felt utterly powerless. Every time I suggested getting a second medical opinion, Elena would shut me down with a thick stack of legal documents and medical directives. She held total power of attorney over David's healthcare and finances. In this house, I was just an intrusive old man. Suddenly, a loud splash broke the silence. David's spoon slipped completely from his grip, sending oatmeal splattering across the expensive white linen tablecloth. Elena snapped, standing up abruptly and staring at the stain with pure disgust. She complained about the imported Italian fabric and muttered about his inability to handle even the simplest tasks. David trembled so hard that his wheelchair began to creak. He panted heavily, repeating apologies to her. I stood up to help him, but Elena raised a hand to stop me, commanding me to sit down and stating she would handle it. She then ordered Lily to go fetch the cleaning supplies immediately. Lily bolted up from her chair. Instead of running to the kitchen, however, she purposely knocked her own fork onto the floor. It clattered against the hardwood and slid deep beneath the heavy walnut table. Lily muttered an apology, claiming it was an accident, and said she would retrieve it. Elena rolled her eyes, channeling her anger into scrubbing the tablecloth. Lily climbed underneath the table. Suddenly I felt a tiny ice-cold hand grip my knee. I froze. Lily searched for my hand in the shadows and pressed a hard, small object tightly into my palm. She squeezed my hand with desperate urgency, then crawled back out from under the table holding her fork. She told us she found it, her voice trembling slightly. I closed my fist tightly, my heart hammering against my ribs like a drum. I looked at Lily. She had settled back into her seat, staring down at her plate, but she gave me an almost imperceptible nod. I tried to keep my voice steady as I announced I needed to use the restroom. Elena didn't even look at me, busy pouring herself a second glass of wine and completely ignoring her husband, who was still quietly apologizing. She casually told me to hurry up, noting they would be clearing the table soon. I walked heavily down the hallway, stepped into the guest bathroom, and locked the door. I turned on the faucet, letting the sound of running water mask any noise. Opening my trembling hand, I saw an electronic key fob wrapped in a piece of paper torn from a school notebook. The handwriting was rushed and jagged, clearly written in the dark. Grandpa, check the Fortress private climate-controlled wine storage facility off Highway 71. Locker B42. Dad rented it without her knowing. You have to see what's inside before Friday. Don't let Mom or her associate find out. They're lying about everything. I stared intently at the words, before Friday. Today was Wednesday. Friday was the final hearing at the Travis County Probate Court to legally declare David incapacitated. If Elena won that hearing, she would gain complete legal control over every asset in David's name, including the multi-million-dollar downtown property and his very life. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. My face looked old and exhausted, but my eyes remained sharp. It was the same look that had sent dozens of white-collar criminals to federal prison. I flushed the note down the toilet, slipped the key fob into my inner jacket pocket, and washed my face with cold water. When I stepped back into the dining room, Elena flashed a plastic, artificial smile, asking if everything was all right. I forced a smile back, which was one of the hardest things I had ever done. I told her I was fine, just feeling my age. I sat back down and looked at David, who was slumped over in his wheelchair, nearly unconscious. Then I looked at Elena, who was casually scrolling through her phone. I thought to myself that she had no idea what was coming. I finished the rest of the meal in silence, calculating my next move. The moment I could leave without raising suspicion, I was driving straight to Highway 71. I had to know exactly what was hidden inside locker B42. The Austin night was stiflingly hot, with occasional rolls of dry thunder echoing like a distant warning. I drove my old Ford F-150 through the edge of the city, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The terrified look in Lily's eyes kept replaying in my mind. A 13-year-old girl should be worrying about algebra tests and school dances, not secretly passing keys to her grandfather to save her father's life. I pulled the truck up to the iron gates of the Fortress Storage Center. The facility sat out in a remote, hilly area, designed to look like an impenetrable military bunker where the wealthy could store vintage wines, fine art, and secrets they wanted kept hidden. The security system looked cold and severe. I rolled down my window, letting the hot air rush in, and pressed the key fob against the scanner. Verification successful. The heavy iron door slid open with a low hum, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Locker. B42 was located deep in the second basement level, at the very end of a long corridor. Pale LED motion lights flickered on one by one, tracing my steps through the silence. When I reached the door, I found it wasn't just a standard rolling shutter, but a massive reinforced steel security door. I swiped the key fob and punched in the date of David's mother's passing, his go-to passcode for everything. With a heavy mechanical click, the lock disengaged. I expected to find boxes of corporate documents or maybe server racks. Instead, what I saw made me gasp. The space had been converted into a secret financial war room and investigation headquarters. The walls were covered in soundproofing material, and in the center stood a massive table piled high with hundreds of bank statements, contract copies, and trust schematics. In the corner, there was even a simple folding cot. My son, a man who once dominated the local business world, had turned this wine locker into a lonely fortress of desperation. "Why didn't you come to me, David?" I whispered into the empty room. I stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of old paper and stale coffee. Walking over to the table, I picked up the top file. It was a bank statement for a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under Elna's maiden name. Massive sums of money had been transferred out just 2 days prior. Even more alarming were several letters of intent from a Las Vegas conglomerate, clearly detailing plans to level David's downtown property to build a luxury casino resort the moment the deed transfer went through. A destructive project David had passionately fought against for years. My hands shook as I kept digging. That was when I noticed the massive whiteboard on the wall. It was covered in David's frantic handwriting, with intricate arrows connecting dates, names, and financial data. But this wasn't just a business investigation. It was a terrifying timeline of his declining health. Week 1. Dizziness, heart palpitations. Elena let the old housekeeper go and insisted on brewing my morning coffee herself. Week 2. Blurred vision, severe hand tremors. Marcus Vance brought in a new private doctor. They prescribed heavy medication and the symptoms worsened. Week 3. Severe muscle weakness, memory gaps. Elena assumed total control of the checkbook. Right in the center of the board, a single sentence written in heavy red marker pierced me straight to the heart, the ink bleeding where he had pressed down with desperate force. "They are systematically wearing me down. It is the morning coffee. She thinks I am losing my mind, but I know my time is running out." A sound escaped me, somewhere between a sob and a growl. My brilliant, proud son had been down here in this freezing bunker all alone, using what little strength he had left to solve the puzzle of his own decline. While I had been making polite conversation with his betrayers at the dinner table, he had been fighting for survival in the dark. I spun around, grabbed a flash drive from the desk, and began shoving documents into my canvas bag. Just then, the motion lights in the hallway flared to life. A massive shadow stretched across the concrete floor. I froze. I was no longer alone. The heavy thud of tactical boots echoed from behind me. I turned around, clutching the canvas bag to my chest like a shield. Standing in the doorway was a private security guard wearing a tactical vest. He carried a real firearm at his hip, rhythmically tapping a collapsible baton against his thigh. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Pendleton," he said, his deep voice dripping with malice. "Mrs. Pendleton mentioned you might try to take things that don't belong to you." Instinct screamed in my head. I was 68 years old, but I had spent my life outsmarting dangerous, desperate white-collar criminals. I scanned the room. No back door. The only exit was right through him. I recognized this man. He was a former tactical officer fired for misconduct, someone Marcus Vance frequently used to make problems disappear. He grinned, showing crooked teeth. "Hand over the bag, old man, and maybe you walk out of here. Otherwise, you might suffer a nasty fall. Older folks are fragile, right?" I didn't think, and I didn't hesitate. I reached down, grabbed the heavy fire extinguisher by the door, yanked the safety pin, and aimed it directly at his face. A blinding cloud of white chemical powder erupted, engulfing him like a localized blizzard. The guard began coughing violently, instinctively raising his arms to shield his face. That single second was all I needed. I charged forward like an angry bull, slamming my shoulder into him and throwing him completely off balance. I sprinted past him down the hall, my lungs burning and my knees protesting, but I never looked back. I threw myself into my pickup truck, locked the doors, and cranked the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the guard burst through the exit, swinging his baton at my window. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the asphalt as the truck launched into the night, leaving him far behind in the dust. I had the records. I had David's journal. But looking in my rearview mirror, I saw a pair of headlights from a black SUV accelerating after me. The pursuit was on. I knew with absolute clarity that if they caught me tonight, I would never make it to Friday. I would just become another tragic statistic in a staged accident. But they made a critical error. They thought they were hunting an easy target, entirely unaware that they had just provoked a seasoned auditor who knew exactly how to track a predator. I reached into my pocket for my phone to call for help, but the screen remained black. Dead battery. I was completely on my own, speeding through the dark Texas night with a target on my back and the evidence to save my son riding shotgun. I gripped the wheel, settling in for the fight of my life. By dawn, I was sitting at my ranch's kitchen counter, staring into a mug of black coffee as the steam swirled into the cool air. My hands had finally stopped shaking, though my heart was still racing. I had made it home alive. I hid David's journal and the offshore trust documents inside the sounding board of the old upright piano in the living room. It was a hiding spot I had used for confidential audit working papers for decades, the one place I knew was completely secure. I hadn't slept a wink. Every time a car passed by outside, my nerves shattered, expecting the guard to arrive and finish the job. But the Texas sun rose anyway, and I was still standing. Then came the knock. It wasn't a polite visit. It was 3 short, commanding strikes against the wood. I checked the microwave clock. 7 a.m. Nothing good ever arrives at 7 in the morning. Taking a deep breath, I purposefully slumped my shoulders, adopting the look of a tired, confused old man, and opened the door. My stomach sank. Elena was standing on my porch. She had traded her designer dress for a simple beige sweater and jeans, looking exactly like a frantic, worried suburban mother. Her eyes were red and puffy, as if she had been crying all night. Standing right behind her like an ominous shadow was Marcus Vance, David's financial advisor, the polished Wall Street shark. He wore a sharp gray suit and held a thick manila folder. "Arthur," Elena choked out, her voice a perfect imitation of grief. "Thank goodness you're awake. We need to talk." I stepped back to let them in, keeping my voice raspy and frail. "Come in. Is it David? Did something happen?" Elena walked past me, the scent of her expensive perfume masking the bitterness of my coffee. She sat down at the small kitchen table, burying her face in her hands. Marcus gave me a cold nod and closed the door behind him. Instead of sitting, he stood near the window, scanning the perimeter. He was checking to see if I was alone. I knew the routine. "Mr. Pendleton," Marcus began, his voice smooth and reassuring, the exact tone he used to pitch high-risk investments to wealthy clients. "We know you visited the storage facility last night." I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge tightly to hide any tremor. "I did," I replied. I was worried. Lily gave me the key. Elena looked up, tears streaming down her face. Oh, Arthur, Lily is just a child. She doesn't understand what's happening. David is confused, so he's making her confused too. What do you mean? I asked, playing the part of the clueless grandfather. I saw strange things in there, Elena. I saw a timeline. David believes you are causing his illness. Elena let out a devastating sob, a performance so convincing it might have fooled me if I didn't know better. Causing it? Arthur, look at me. I love him. I've spent every dime of our liquid assets trying to find a cure. Marcus stepped forward and slid the manila folder across the table toward me. Open it, Mr. Pendleton, please. You need to see the reality of the situation. I opened the folder to find medical reports bearing official laboratory seals, toxicology screens, brain scans, and psychiatric evaluations. David isn't being harmed by anyone else, Marcus said softly. David has developed a severe substance dependency, Arthur. His paranoia is a direct result of abusing unprescribed pharmaceutical compounds. I looked at the documents, which claimed David's system carried high concentrations of synthetic stimulants. Marcus pointed a manicured finger at a dark spot on the brain scan. That locker wasn't an investigation center, Marcus continued smoothly, weaving his narrative. It was where he hid his substances and lost his grip on reality. David has been secretly acquiring these dangerous chemicals, mistakenly believing they would treat his imagined illnesses. The tremors, the delusions, he brought them on himself. I stared at him. It was a flawless deception. It explained away the chaos of the bunker, perfectly shifting the blame to David, while framing the two of them as the suffering protectors. If I hadn't seen the truth with my own eyes, and if I hadn't decoded the specific financial irregularities in David's records, this mountain of forged medical and financial paperwork would have completely blinded me. Elena reached out, her hand ice cold as she gripped my arm. She told me their plan was to place him in a fully secured residential care facility this coming Friday, explaining that the entire purpose of the hearing was to force him into treatment. She claimed that if they didn't secure legal guardianship, he would destroy himself. She brought up the wine locker, asking if I had seen how unhinged he had become, and questioned whether I could really stand by and watch my own son succumb to his delusions. I looked down at the forged medical reports, a searing rage burning in the back of my throat. They were gaslighting me. They were trying to paint my son's desperate struggle for survival as the unhinged ramblings of a broken mind. They wanted to lock him away legally, use heavy medication to completely dull his senses, and strip him of everything he owned. But I knew I couldn't confront them yet. Not here in this kitchen, entirely unarmed and outnumbered. I had to let them believe they had won, making them think I was just a defeated, overwhelmed old father, broken by medical authority. I let my shoulders drop, allowing my entire posture to sag. I rubbed my eyes and whimpered quietly, acting as though I had no idea he was involved with substances, muttering that he had always been a good kid. Elena tightened her grip on my hand, telling me she knew it was heartbreaking, but insisting they had to stay strong to save him. Marcus visibly relaxed. I saw the tension leave his shoulders. He genuinely believed he had handled the old auditor. Elena wiped away a tear and mentioned that the security guard told them I had fled the facility. She added that he reported I took some papers, claiming they were nothing but the ramblings of a sick mind. However, she warned that if the authorities found them, David could face serious legal trouble for possessing unprescribed compounds, concluding that they needed to destroy those papers to protect him. There lay the trap. If I handed over the documents, I lost my evidence. If I refused, they would know I was playing a part. I lied, keeping my voice trembling. This time I didn't even have to fake the fear. The memory of last night's pursuit was entirely genuine. I told them I had lost them, claiming that when the man with the baton chased me, I panicked and thought I was being robbed. I asserted that I threw the bag into a dumpster along Highway 71 just to escape with my life. Marcus narrowed his eyes, staring intently at my face, searching for any micro-expression that might betray a lie. I met his gaze without flinching, letting my eyes fill with the raw, unprotected fear of a father terrified for his family. After a long, agonizing silence, Marcus nodded, suggesting that it might be for the best. He stated they would send a cleaning crew to empty the wine locker later that day to dispose of everything securely, adding that no one else needed to know about David's unfortunate downward spiral. Elena stood up and adjusted her clothes. She thanked me for being understanding, acknowledging how difficult this was, but reassured me that on Friday they would get him the care he deserved. She told me to stay home and rest, leaving the legal matters to them. Then she leaned down and kissed my cheek. Her lips felt like dry ice. Marcus added that they could see themselves out. I watched them walk toward the front door. I stood there, looking small and defeated, waiting for them to leave so I could finally breathe. Just as Marcus reached for the doorknob, I caught a detail. Marcus paused briefly to shift his weight, and my eyes fell to his footwear. He was wearing an expensive pair of custom Italian Lucchese leather boots, polished to a high shine, except for the heel. Wedge-shaped into the deep tread of his left heel was a thick caked piece of white earth. That wasn't the dark organic soil from my ranch, nor was it the typical gray dust of downtown Austin. It was limestone dust, a highly specific type of white limestone powder, found in Travis County only within the geological quarry belt to the west, exactly where the new resort development was scheduled to break ground, the precise location of David's property, and their secret construction site. My breath hitched. They were lying completely. They claimed they were sending a crew later, but Marcus himself had already been out there last night. He had walked through the muddy terrain in the rain to personally oversee the destruction of evidence. He had erased the truth with his own hands. Elena called out from the door, asking if I was going to see them out. I snapped my head up, quickly telling her no, adding that I would just lock up behind them. Marcus wished me well as he stepped outside, but the white limestone dust on his heel left a faint, pale mark on my hardwood floor. A tiny piece of forensic evidence left right in the old auditor's home. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt. I listened to the engine of Elena's Range Rover fade down the driveway. Then I collapsed to my knees, staring intently at that small trace of white powder on the floor. This was my sole physical proof that their timeline was an absolute fabrication. They thought they had neutralized me. They thought I was just an aging, confused man who threw vital evidence into a dumpster. They thought they had plenty of time to permanently handle David before Friday. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old flip phone. It was basic, but it had a camera. I snapped a sharp close-up of the powder on the floor. Then I stood up, walked over to the piano, and retrieved the journal from the sounding board. "You made a critical mistake, Mr. Vance," I whispered to the empty room. "You walked into my house carrying the soil of the crime scene. Now I know exactly where you were last night. I wasn't going to rest, and I wasn't staying home." The previous night, while embracing David, I had used a pair of nail clippers to discreetly take a small clipping of his fingernails and pulled a few strands of his hair, keeping them safely tucked in my jacket pocket. I knew a former DEA toxicologist whom I had helped clear during a complex, unjust tax investigation back in the 90s. He owed me a massive favor. The game was far from over. It was just beginning. I had 48 hours, and I was going to use the dust from that man's boot and a laboratory analysis to dig the legal graves they deserved. Watching the taillights disappear at the end of the road, I turned and locked the door completely. The house was dead silent, but it was no longer a peaceful quiet. It felt heavy, like the low pressure right before a tornado hits. I walked over to the coat rack by the door, where the waterproof trench coat I wore last night was still dripping. I stared at it. That coat was the last thing to touch my son. When I left the dinner party the night before, I'd given David a brief, hurried hug. During that second, I had slipped the small plastic bag, the one I usually used for my blood pressure medication, out of my pocket to conceal the hair and nail samples. This was the only piece of David I had left that Elena and Marcus couldn't touch. Time was running out. If Marcus had spent the night clearing out the wine locker, he was undoubtedly scrambling to erase every other trace. I grabbed my keys and slipped out the back door. I couldn't risk driving my truck. They knew the license plate. Braving the brutal Texas sun, I walked 3 blocks to a secluded bus stop, pulling my baseball cap low and watching every passing vehicle like a fugitive. The bus dropped me off in East Austin in front of an unremarkable red brick building. This was the private environmental toxicology lab run by Frank Miller. Frank owed me his career, if not his life. 20 years ago, during a major insurance investigation involving a chemical plant incident, he had been falsely accused of tampering with evidence. I was the auditor who tracked the actual cash flows, exposed the real bribery, and cleared his name. At the time, he told me that if I ever needed anything, no matter what, he would be there. I prayed he still kept his word. I stepped inside the lab, the sharp scent of chemical reagents instantly triggering memories of countless fraud scenes. Frank was hunched over a mass spectrometer, his gray hair messy and wild. Hearing the chime above the door, he looked up, a flash of surprise crossing behind his thick lenses. He remarked in his raspy, smoke-worn voice that he hadn't seen me since his retirement party, adding that I looked like I had just crawled out of a war zone. I told him I didn't have time to catch up, placing the small plastic bag firmly onto his workbench. I demanded a comprehensive toxicology screen on the hair and nail samples immediately, emphasizing that it needed to stay completely off the record. Frank looked at the bag, then looked at my face, reading the sheer desperation in my eyes. Without asking a single question, he nodded and took the samples. He told me to give him an hour and turned back to his equipment. I sat down on a plastic chair in the waiting room, the rigid back digging into my spine. 1 hour. When your son's life is hanging in the balance, a single hour feels like an eternity. I pulled out my old flip phone to check the time, and right then it vibrated. A new text message appeared from an unlisted number. I opened it, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. "Stop digging, old man, or you're going to lose your granddaughter next." I stared at the screen, the text blurring before my eyes. Lily. They were actively watching me. They knew I wasn't at home resting. They knew I was fighting back. How did they know? I looked around the empty waiting area, paranoia and dread creeping up my neck like a snake. Was there a camera? Had Frank been compromised? No, Frank was completely loyal. It had to be my phone. They were likely tracking my location through an app or a digital trace. I stood up, walked over to the trash can in the corner, took one last look at the wallpaper photo of David and Lily on the screen, and dropped the phone inside. I couldn't risk them tracking me here and involving Frank. I paced the small room, my mind racing. If they laid a single finger on Lily, I would dismantle them. I would throw the rules out the window and tear their lives apart myself. The thought actually startled me. I had spent my entire life as a strict, rule-following auditor, but the rules were broken now. The rules were being twisted to legally end my son's life. The laboratory door clicked open and Frank stepped out. He held a printed report, his face pale, far whiter than usual. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes hard. In a very low voice, he asked me whose samples these were. My voice shook as I told him they belonged to my son, David. Frank let out a long, heavy breath and handed the paperwork over to me. He explained that he ran a standard substance screen first, finding absolutely no trace of stimulants or unprescribed pharmaceuticals, nothing that Marcus Vance had claimed. However, he noted that when he examined the structure of the hair shaft, he found severe cellular degradation. That prompted him to run a cross-reference against a database of heavy metals and plant-based toxins. He pointed to a sharp, spiking red line on the graph. "Digoxin," Frank said grimly. "Foxglove extract. The levels are off the charts, Arthur. It's a highly toxic plant derivative that targets the heart, completely tasteless and odorless. It causes severe arrhythmias, nerve damage, blurred vision, intense tremors, and eventually total heart failure. The symptoms perfectly mimic advanced neurodegenerative diseases, making it the perfect tool for someone trying to disguise a crime as a natural passing." I stared at the numbers on the page. The concentration was sitting right on the edge of a fatal threshold. My voice was barely a whisper as I asked him how long this had been happening. Frank tapped the paper, explaining that based on the growth layers in the nail sample, he had been ingesting it consistently for at least 3 months. But then he pointed to a massive surge over the past week. warning me that they were rapidly increasing the dosage. He stated flatly that if David kept taking whatever they were giving him, he wouldn't survive the weekend. His kidneys would fail first, followed by sudden cardiac arrest. I balled the report into a tight fist. Foxglove extract. They were systematically feeding my son a historic, lethal toxin while telling the world he was an unstable addict. The sheer cruelty of it was suffocating. I asked him if this report could hold up in a court of law. Frank nodded grimly, confirming the report was absolute ironclad proof. However, he warned that I still needed to locate the source of administration, meaning the specific container they were using to deliver the toxin. He explained that if I could get even a microscopic residue, he could match the chemical signature perfectly. I shoved the report into my pocket. I knew exactly where the source was. I remembered what David had written on his whiteboard. It is the morning coffee. Every single morning, Elena personally brewed a specific premium blend for David using their high-end espresso machine. Thank you, Frank. I turned and headed straight for the door. Frank called out after me, telling me to be careful. He warned that whoever was behind a slow, deliberate poisoning like this was bound to be highly patient and completely cold-blooded, and they wouldn't make mistakes easily. I pushed the door open and stepped back out into the harsh Texas sun. I didn't feel the chill anymore. Instead, a searing fire burned in my chest. I had the scientific evidence. Now I just needed to survive long enough to use it. They were threatening my granddaughter and poisoning my son, operating under the assumption that they were merely dealing with a helpless old man. I pulled up my collar and blended into the pedestrian traffic on the sidewalk. I didn't head back to my ranch. I was going right back into the lion's den. I had to get back to David's house. I needed to find that container of poisoned coffee. I knew exactly where to search. The kitchen. If Elena was administering the toxin, that had to be the place. She was the only one who prepared David's meals. I waited under the shade of a tree a block away from the house, keeping my eyes locked on the driveway. Elena's Range Rover wasn't there, and neither was Marcus's car. The house was completely dark except for the dim blue glow of the television radiating from the living room, meaning David was likely slumped in his wheelchair, staring blankly at the screen. Lily wouldn't be home from her private school until 4. This was my window. I moved along the tall holly hedge I had personally planted 10 years ago, using the shadows to reach the side of the house. Walking up to a home I had once helped pay for, I felt like a common thief. I gripped a spare key in my hand. When Elena started changing the locks on the main doors, she completely forgot about this key to the side laundry room entrance. I slid it into the lock, praying she hadn't updated this one yet. Click! The mechanism turned. I let out a sharp breath and slipped inside. The interior smelled of lavender air freshener, mixed with harsh chemical cleaners, a transparent attempt to mask the underlying scent of a medical crisis. I kept my footsteps light as I moved through the laundry room and into the kitchen. The space was immaculate. The marble countertops gleamed, and the stainless steel appliances reflected the recessed lighting with a cold shine. It looked like a showroom, entirely devoid of actual warmth. I went straight to the walk-in pantry. The shelves were loaded with organic protein powders, vitamin supplements, and various bags of artisanal coffee beans. I began checking them one by one, opening each container. The seals were intact, and the contents looked entirely normal. Frustration began to set in. Where had she hidden it? Foxglove extract is colorless and tasteless. She could have blended it into anything. I checked the spice rack, finding nothing. I searched the refrigerator, seeing only almond milk and green juice. Then I spotted it. Deep in the shadows on the very top shelf of the pantry, tucked right behind a massive tub of whey protein, sat a small, unlabeled, airtight glass jar. It was filled with a dark brown powder that looked almost identical to the light roast coffee next to it, though the grind was significantly finer. I reached up for it. The exact moment my fingertips touched the cold glass, the heavy sound of the front door unlocking echoed through the house. Laughter followed, a woman's laughter. Elena. And then came a man's low, polished voice. I froze, my heart slamming against my ribs so loudly I was certain they would hear it. They weren't supposed to be here. It was only 2 in the afternoon. Elena was supposed to be at her charity luncheon, and Marcus should have been at his wealth management office. Elena's voice sounded breathless and hurried as she muttered about not wanting to wait another second. Marcus asked if she was sure about doing this here. Right here, Elena replied. She added that David was completely out, noting she had doubled his sedatives and that he wouldn't be waking up until tomorrow morning. Footsteps followed. The sharp click of high heels on the hardwood floor was heading straight toward the kitchen. Panic set in. There was nowhere to run, and the back exit was too far. The only available hiding spot was the narrow broom closet, right next to the refrigerator. I dove inside, pulling the slatted door shut the exact moment they stepped into the room. Through the gaps in the closet door, I watched them. Marcus pressed Elena against the central kitchen island, kissing her neck. His hands were around her waist, and her fingers were tangled in his hair. A wave of intense nausea hit me. My son was upstairs, heavily medicated and fighting a losing battle for his life, while his wife was downstairs engaged in an affair with the very man entrusted to protect his estate. Marcus pulled back slightly, looking up at the ceiling as he asked if she was absolutely certain David was completely unconscious. Elena let out another cruel laugh, stating that he was essentially a fixture in the room at this point. She added that once the probate court declared him incapacitated on Friday, nature would take its course by the following week. I held my breath, clamping my hand tightly over my mouth to prevent myself from making a sound. Marcus unbuttoned his shirt, asking if she had managed to recover the documents from the old man. Elena scoffed, dismissing me as a confused old man. She claimed I completely fell for the cover story about a substance problem, adding that I seemed relieved to think David was just an addict. She noted that since I had thrown the evidence away, they were entirely safe. Marcus chuckled softly, remarking how perfect the situation was. He stated that the moment the judge signed the trust transfer and the full guardianship order on Friday, they would effectively pull the plug. He detailed their plan to move David to a hospice facility, halt all supportive care, and let heart failure wrap things up, concluding that it would look exactly like a tragic, natural passing. Elena added that the property and the $50 million valuation would then belong entirely to them. They embraced again, their movements driven by raw greed. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears of pure anger burning down my cheeks. They had mapped out every single step. The poisoning was just the initial phase. The legal, financial theft was the second, and his ultimate passing was the final act. They were actively celebrating his downfall right in his own kitchen. Elena panted, suggesting they take things upstairs where the bed would be more comfortable. Marcus refused, claiming that doing it right there on the counter offered a greater sense of total control. I was forced to listen. I listened to the sounds of their betrayal, watching them dishonor my son's home. All I could do was crouch inside that cramped closet, holding the glass jar of lethal powder tightly to my chest, praying that this sample would be the exact piece of evidence to put them away for good. The minutes dragged on like agonizing hours. Finally, the noise stopped, and they began adjusting their clothes amid quiet laughter. Marcus mentioned he needed to get back to the office for a trust committee meeting, remarking on the sheer irony of the situation. Elena giggled, telling him to call her later. She added that she was going to brew David's afternoon coffee to keep the chemical concentration steady in his system. She turned and walked directly toward the walk-in pantry. My heart stopped. I was standing inside the closet right next to it. If she looked down, or if she noticed the jar had been shifted, I heard the sharp clink of glass. She was operating the espresso machine. The loud whir of the grinder filled the kitchen. She whispered a mock toast to his health into the empty room. Then dead silence followed. The front door opened and snapped shut. I waited 1 minute, then 2, then 5. I pushed the closet door open and stumbled out, my legs trembling so violently I could barely stand. Shoving the small glass jar deep into my pocket, I no longer cared about preserving fingerprints. I walked straight into the living room. David was there, sitting in his wheelchair, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows. His head was tilted sharply to the side, his mouth slightly open, a thin trail of saliva pooling on his medical gown. "David!" I choked out. There was absolutely no response, and his skin felt entirely cold to the touch. I fought back tears as I leaned over him, whispering how sorry I was that I hadn't protected him better. But I made a quiet vow to him and to his late mother that Friday would not be a day of triumph for them. It would be their day of judgment. I kissed his forehead, turned, and began to run. I sprinted toward the side exit, bursting out into the stifling afternoon air, while shielding that jar of poison like a sacred object. I had the means, I discovered the motive, and I knew their exact deadline. Friday. I had less than 48 hours to stop this ongoing crime, and I knew I was going to need serious outside help to do it. I pushed the glass jar deeper into my coat pocket, feeling it press hard against my hip as I moved. I had collected everything required. Now, the challenge was simply escaping the grounds alive. The driveway was blocked by their vehicles, meaning the laundry room side exit remained my only viable path out, but that required navigating past the kitchen once more. The faint, steady hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet house. The silence felt deafening. I took a single step forward. A loose floorboard gave way beneath my weight, letting out a sharp, piercing creak. In the vacant hallway, the sound echoed like a gunshot. I froze instantly. Elena's voice cut sharply through the air, demanding to know who was there. Her tone carried no trace of fear, only intense alertness. I offered no reply, slowly stepping backward into the deep shadows of the dining room. Almost immediately, I heard the rapid, heavy thud of footsteps approaching. I spun around to run, but my foot caught the edge of a small decorative table in the entryway. A heavy crystal vase resting on top, one of Elena's prized luxury pieces, wobbled violently and tipped over the edge. I lunged forward in a desperate attempt to catch it, but my reflexes were far too slow. The vase shattered against the hardwood floor with a loud, explosive crash. A slow, deliberate mocking sound echoed down the hall. I snapped my head up. Elena was standing at the end of the corridor, leaning casually against the doorframe with her arms crossed. A smug, triumphant smirk played on her lips. She didn't look shocked at all. In fact, she looked as though she had been waiting for me this entire time. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Arthur," she said smoothly. "You've always been so incredibly predictable. That savior complex of yours never really fades, does it?" I straightened my posture, brushing the stray bits of glass from my jacket. I locked my eyes onto hers, pulling together every ounce of authority I had left. I told her that this was over, and that I knew all about the digoxin. I made it clear that I had the sample and had overheard her entire conversation with Marcus, warning her that they were looking at a very long time behind bars. Elena laughed, a dry, completely humorless sound. She scoffed at the idea of prison, asking who would ever believe me. She pointed out that I was a 68-year-old man with a history of heart issues who had recently shown signs of early dementia, adding with a smirk that Marcus would be updating my medical files to reflect exactly that tonight. She took a step closer, a vicious gleam in her eyes. She accused me of breaking into her home and terrorizing her, framing herself as a defenseless woman home alone, while her unstable father-in-law forced his way inside. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, instinctively taking a step back. She pulled her phone from her pocket, the screen already illuminated. She revealed that she had contacted the authorities 5 minutes ago, the moment the silent alarm on the back entrance tripped. She mocked me for thinking she would leave herself unprotected while knowing I was lingering around, comparing me to an old dog that refused to let go of a bone. Then came the sirens. I heard them in the distance, growing louder and closer by the second. "You are completely out of your mind," I yelled at her. "You are ending your husband's life for money." "I am putting an end to his suffering," Elena replied, her voice turning suddenly cold and flat. "And I am taking what I rightfully earned. I put up with his obsession with work for a solid decade. I smiled through his boring dinners and played the part of the perfect wife. Now it's my turn to be happy. And you're just a pathetic, confused old man." The sirens became deafening. Red and blue emergency lights flashed through the front windows, casting chaotic patterns across the walls. Tires screeched in the driveway, followed by the heavy slam of car doors. "Austin Police Department, open up!" Elena's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. She deliberately messed up her hair, tore the top button off her sweater, squeezed her eyes shut, and let out a chilling, incredibly realistic sob. She screamed for help, begging them to save her and claiming I had lost my mind. The front door was kicked open. 2 armed officers rushed in, their firearms drawn. "Show me your hands. Get them behind your head." I raised my empty hands, shouting that I didn't have a weapon. I told them I was his father and that she was lying, insisting she was poisoning David with digoxin. "Get on the ground right now," the younger officer with a buzz cut barked. He lunged forward, roughly grabbing my arms and twisting them behind my back. A sharp burst of pain shot through my shoulder as I groaned, my knees hitting the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Elena wailed, pointing a trembling finger at me as she cried to the officers that I had broken in. She claimed I had been stalking her, cornered her in the kitchen, and attempted to harm her. The severe accusation hung heavy in the air. I gasped for breath, shouting that it was an absolute lie. I begged them to check her pockets and search the pantry, telling them the evidence was right in there. "Quiet down, old man," the officer snapped, pressing my face firmly against the floor. Elena buried her face in the other officer's shoulder, sobbing that I had been obsessing over conspiracies for weeks. She claimed I believed the authorities were watching him, and that she was some kind of corporate spy. She noted she had told me to stay away, but I broke in anyway, pointing to the shattered vase and claiming I had thrown it at her. I struggled against the handcuffs, the cold metal digging deep into my wrists. I pleaded with the officer to listen, telling him my son was unconscious upstairs. I yelled that she and Marcus Vance were ending his life, and that I had the evidence in my coat pocket, screaming about the glass jar. The officer holding me down patted me down, pulling the glass jar of brown powder from my jacket. He held it up, asking what it was. "That's it?" I shouted. "That's the evidence. Please run a lab test on it." Elena gasped dramatically, crying out that I had brought illicit substances into her home to frame her. She claimed I had previously threatened to plant contraband in the house if she didn't give me money. The officer shook his head, looking down at me with pure disgust. He muttered about illegal entry, assault, and possession of a suspected controlled substance, remarking that I had managed to keep myself busy for an old man. They hauled me to my feet, my legs feeling as heavy as lead. I looked over at Elena. She was hiding her face in her hands, but her eyes were completely dry. She caught my gaze and gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. "You won't get away with this," I roared as they dragged me toward the exit. "You can't silence everyone." Elena's fake agonizing cries echoed behind me, sobbing that she was so sorry and promising they would get me help. The cool night air hit my face, but it did nothing to calm the fire inside me. I was roughly pushed into the back of the cruiser, the hard plastic seat freezing cold against my back. I could see the neighbors standing on their porches, watching the scene unfold in silence. I knew exactly what they were thinking. "Look at Arthur. He's lost it and attacked his own family." I pressed my forehead against the metal partition separating me from the officers, feeling a single tear slip down my nose. It wasn't out of fear. It was pure, unadulterated frustration. They had confiscated my phone, taken the jar of powder, and stripped away my freedom. However, they had missed the hidden inner pocket of my trench coat. The sealed plastic bag containing David's hair and nail samples was still safe right there, and Frank had already verified the first batch. As the cruiser rounded the corner, I watched David's house vanish from view. I was heading to a cell, but I was far from defeated. Elena had miscalculated. She believed that humiliating me and locking me up would break my resolve. She had no idea that she had just provided me with the ultimate cover. In this system, all I needed was one single phone call to flip the entire board. And I knew exactly who to call. Not a defense attorney and not a friend, but someone who despised Marcus Vance even more than I did. I closed my eyes, listening to the wail of the siren. Let them think I was unstable. Let them think I was highly dangerous, because by the time I walked out of there, I was going to become their worst nightmare. The heavy steel cell door slid shut with a sharp, grating clang, the loneliest sound I had ever heard. The echo bounced around the concrete holding cell, cutting right through to my bones, sealing me inside a gray box of absolute isolation. I sat down on the thin metal bench bolted to the wall, the deep chill immediately seeping through my trousers. The air inside smelled of old sweat, industrial bleach, and the accumulated desperation of hundreds who had sat there before me. But not a single one of them had a son fading away in a multi-million-dollar mansion just miles away, and none of them had a 13-year-old granddaughter sleeping under the same roof as a criminal. I buried my face in my hands. For the first time in 40 years, I felt completely powerless. I was Arthur Pendleton, the forensic auditor who could spot a CEO's lie from across a boardroom table. The man who could dismantle a multi-million-dollar shell company scam using nothing but a ledger and intuition. And now I was just inmate number 492, locked away as a confused old man for allegedly attacking a grieving daughter-in-law. Time moved in a blur. I had no watch. They had taken my belt, my shoelaces, and my dignity. The only way to track the passing hours was the changing of the guards, and the cold, unidentifiable meals slid through the slot in the door. I didn't touch the food. I couldn't swallow a bite. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw David. I saw his head slumped lifelessly to the side, the saliva tracing down his chin, and that final look of absolute trust in his eyes before the toxin clouded his mind. And I kept seeing that wink Elena gave me as the police shoved me into the car. That wink haunted me like a living nightmare, a psychopath's declaration of absolute victory. Sometime around the middle of the night, or perhaps early morning, a woman in a white lab coat came to see me. She was young, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, carrying a clipboard. She introduced herself as the court-appointed psychiatric evaluator. She spoke to me slowly, pronouncing each word with exaggerated clarity as if talking to a toddler. "Mr. Pendleton, do you know where you are right now? Do you understand why you were brought here?" I tried to lay it all out. I sat up straight, using my most professional, analytical tone. I explained the digoxin, the fabricated medical charts, and the illicit connection between Elena and her financial advisor, Marcus Vance. I presented every fact clearly, just as if I were delivering testimony before a grand jury. She listened, nodding politely while taking rapid notes on her pad, but when I finished, there was no outrage on her face, only pity. She tapped her pen against the clipboard and asked a question that completely shattered my defenses. She gently asked if I had been forgetting things lately, or if I frequently felt like people were watching me and trying to cause me harm. In that exact moment, the reality sank in. She had already reviewed Elena's statement and looked over the forged dementia evaluations Marcus had submitted. To her, my tight logic sounded like a conspiracy theory, and my profound grief sounded like mania. When she left, she didn't offer to contact the district attorney. She simply instructed the guard to place me on a watch list for self-harm. I lay flat on the rigid bunk, staring blankly up at the ceiling. The despair felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest, cutting off my breath. Tomorrow was Friday. Friday was the final hearing, the day Elena would be legally authorized to dictate David's fate. Once she secured that ultimate guardianship, she could legally halt all treatment and effectively pull the plug, and I would be left to rot in this cell, forced to watch them bury my son and squander everything he left behind. And then there was Lily. What would happen to Lily? She was the sole remaining witness. If she tried to speak the truth, would she be the next one served a special morning coffee? The thought made me physically sick. I curled onto my side, facing the cold concrete wall, forcing down the bile rising in my throat. I had failed them completely, utterly outmaneuvered by a woman who treated a crime like a corporate merger. "You're making too much noise, old man," a voice called down from the top bunk. I had completely forgotten I wasn't alone in the cell. Since I arrived, the person above had been nothing but a silent lump beneath a blanket. I turned my head as a pair of legs swung over the edge, followed by a massive frame. He dropped silently onto the concrete floor. Despite his heavy build, he looked to be roughly my age, though far more worn by time. His face looked like a road map of scars and past hardships, framed by a graying beard and faded tattoos that melted into his wrinkled skin. He looked like a man who had completely washed his hands of the world long ago. "I'm sorry," I murmured softly. "I didn't mean to wake you." He walked over to the steel bars, leaning against them and looking out into the empty corridor, ignoring me entirely. He remarked in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding together that I had been muttering in my sleep, talking about poison and a boy named David, adding that it sounded like I was running out of time. I sat up, rubbing my face hard. I admitted that I was entirely out of time, explaining that my son was fading away while I was trapped in here, and that his wife was the one behind it. The man turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were dark and piercing, carrying a dangerous sort of intelligence. He stared at my face for a long moment, a microscopic scrutiny that felt intensely uncomfortable. Then his expression shifted, and the hardness around his eyes softened just a fraction. "Arthur," he said flatly. It wasn't a question. He was stating my name. I froze. "Do I know you?" The man let out a dry, raspy chuckle. He remarked that I wouldn't remember him, but he certainly remembered me, bringing up a warehouse fire on East 6th Street 20 years ago. My mind raced, searching through decades of files. The East 6th Street fire, it was a massive multi-million-dollar arson investigation. The authorities were moving to indict the property owner for intentionally torching the building to collect the insurance payout, and the firm was ready to deny the claim. But I had conducted a deep financial audit and a thorough physical inspection, spending 3 days crawling through the charred ruins, breathing in a lungful of ash. "I found the faulty wiring," I said, the memory prompting me to blurt it out. "It wasn't arson, it was a short circuit in an old breaker box. Rats chewed through the insulation. The man nodded. "That's right. Back then, everyone said I was just a fraud looking for quick cash. But you stood up at that hearing and told them the truth with ironclad proof. You saved me from 10 years in prison. You saved my reputation. My name is Jack Miller." I stared at him. I remembered the case, but the man before me looked entirely different from the factory owner in a neat suit from my memory. Years and hardships had sculpted him into a different person. "The business ended up going under anyway," Miller said with a shrug. "Hard times, bad luck, and then some poor choices down the road, so here I am. But I never forgot that you didn't look at me like a criminal. You only looked at the evidence." He left the bars and walked to the deepest, darkest corner of the cell, kneeling to search along the hem of his trousers. I watched him in confusion. "Why are you in here?" Miller asked without looking up. I laid out the entire situation. I told him about the basement wine locker piled with documents, the forged medical reports, and my arrest. I explained that I just needed to make one phone call to a Texas oil tycoon named Richard Collins. He was the only man in all of Austin with enough power and motivation to get me out before Friday. But the police had taken my phone. Miller stood up, walked over to me, and opened his palm. Resting in his hand was a tiny black object. It was a microphone, smaller than a credit card, a piece of prison contraband that, if discovered, was enough to add years to his sentence. "It's not a smartphone," Miller whispered. "You can't browse the web, but it makes calls. The battery is very low, so don't waste time." I stared intently at that phone. It felt like a lifeline thrown into the middle of a stormy sea. "Why?" I asked. "You'll be thrown into solitary." Miller shoved the phone into my hand, forcing my fingers shut over it. His grip was strong and calloused. "Because back then, you were the only one who believed in me when nobody else did," he said. "And right now, I believe in you. Your eyes look exactly the same as they did back then. The look of someone who knows the truth and just needs one shot to prove it. Call your backup, Arthur. Save your son." Looking at the tiny device in my hand, my heart began to race again, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was hope. I looked up at Miller. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said, climbing back onto the top bunk and pulling up his blanket. "Just get out of here. And when you catch that woman, give her hell for me." I retreated to the corner of the cell furthest from the guard station. Blocking the phone with my body, I pressed the power button. The screen lit up with a dim blue glow. I prayed Richard Collins was awake, and I prayed his hatred for Marcus Vance was deep enough to make him help. I also prayed this little piece of plastic would be the key to unlocking the cage trapping my family. I dialed the number from memory, pressed the phone to my ear, and waited for the ringing tone. Huddled in the corner of the cell, I used my body to shield that tiny screen like a candle in a hurricane. My fingers were too blunt for the miniature keypad, but I didn't need to look up the number. Over the past 5 years, I had memorized every detail of this man. Richard Collins, the tyrant of a Texas energy conglomerate. He had publicly vowed to ruin Marcus Vance after Marcus crossed him in a leveraged buyout. He was my last hope. Not because he was a good man, but because he was a smart shark, and a shark will always bite if it senses blood in the water. I pressed the call button. Static hissed through the line, and then it began to ring. Once, twice. It was 3 a.m. Any ordinary person would be sound asleep. But Richard Collins was not an ordinary person. "Who is this?" A sharp, irritated voice with a heavy Texas drawl demanded from the other end. "This is a private, encrypted line." "Richard." I lowered my voice, my throat raspy from dehydration. "It's Arthur Pendleton." A long, heavy silence followed on the other end, followed by a cruel scoff. "Arthur Pendleton, Austin's Father of the Year. I heard you got picked up for assaulting your poor daughter-in-law. It's all over the night news. What's the matter, Arthur, calling me in the middle of the night? Looking for a job sweeping floors now that you're ruined?" I didn't take the bait. I didn't have time to cater to his ego. I gripped the phone tightly, feeling the plastic edges dig into my palm. "I'm not looking for a job, Richard. I'm here to make a deal. If you hang up right now, you can get ready to spend the rest of your days in a federal cell just like the one I'm sitting in." The laughter stopped. "What are you rambling about, old man? You're delusional. The police report said you've lost your mind." I took a deep breath. This was everything. It was the biggest bluff of my life, and I had to play it so perfectly that even I believed it. "I went to that private wine locker, Richard. Facility off Highway 71, Locker B42. Elena told the police it was a substance den, but she missed something. She missed the encrypted ledger hidden behind the ventilation duct. Care to guess what name I found in there?" I paused, letting the silence stretch indefinitely, using his own anxiety to fill the blank space. "I saw your name, Richard. I saw the transaction records. You paid Marcus $2 million in lobbying fees through your shell company registered in the Cayman Islands for that downtown resort project. Once David passes and the land is sold, that money gets washed clean. It was a complete fabrication. I hadn't found any ledger, and I had no proof connecting Richard directly to the money. But I knew Richard Collins all too well. He was a man who would do whatever it took to get what he wanted. Even if he wasn't directly involved in the plot against David, he undoubtedly had under-the-table deals with Marcus. Just the mention of potential federal involvement would make the old fox break into a cold sweat. "You're lying," Richard hissed, but the arrogance had completely vanished from his voice, replaced by tight anxiety. "Am I?" I kept my tone deadpan and steady. "The evidence is in my hands, Richard, or rather in the hands of my partner on the outside. If I'm not released within 2 hours, those statements will land directly on the desks of the district attorney and the Wall Street Journal. Think about the headlines, Richard. Energy tycoon linked to forced land acquisition. Your stock will crash before the opening bell tomorrow, and your board will skin you alive." Nothing but dead silence came through the line. I could hear his heavy breathing and practically hear the gears turning in his head as he calculated the risks. He didn't know what cards I was holding, but he didn't dare risk it. In his world, perception was reality, and I was threatening to shatter his. "What do you want?" He finally spoke, every syllable heavy with defeat. "I want out," I said. "I want your attorney. Not some soft corporate lawyer who handles contracts, but the fixer who cleans up your messes. Have him come down to the Travis County 4th Precinct. Tell him to use whatever legal loophole it takes. Bail, habeas corpus, I don't care. Get me out of this cage." "And the evidence?" Richard asked. "I get you out, and you promise to bury those documents forever?" I lied. "Deal." "Fine," he spat viciously. "Give me 20 minutes. But if you're playing me, Arthur, I'll personally ensure you regret it." He hung up, and the line went dead. As the adrenaline began to fade, my hands started shaking uncontrollably. I leaned back against the cold concrete wall. I had done it. I stared down the devil and forced him to blink first. Jack Miller watched me from the top bunk. He didn't say a word, but he gave a slow, respectful nod. He knew what a desperate man looked like, and he knew I had just won the biggest pot with a terrible hand. I handed the phone back to him. "Thank you," I whispered. "Keep it," Miller said as he lay back down. "You might still need it." I waited. The minutes dragged on like hours. I paced the small cell. 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. Did Richard call his lawyer, or did he report my contraband phone to the guards? Was I about to walk free, or would I be thrown straight into solitary confinement? 1,000 scenarios flashed through my mind, each one worse than the last. Then I heard it, the sharp click of expensive leather heels on the concrete floor. It was entirely distinct from the heavy thud of a guard's boots. It was the sound of authority. The heavy iron gate slid open with a harsh scrape. A guard stood there, looking annoyed and a bit confused. Behind him stood a man wearing a midnight blue suit, tailored straight out of London. He carried a briefcase, looking around the cell with an expression that mixed boredom with sheer disdain. "Arthur Pendleton," the man in the suit spoke, his voice as smooth as oiled glass. "I'm Arthur Sterling, attorney at law. Mr. Collins sent me. Grab your things, let's go." I stood up, my knees cracking. The guard unlocked the inner gate. "Hold on," the guard muttered. "The paperwork says no bail, mandatory psychiatric hold." Mr. Sterling didn't even look at the guard. He pulled a document from his briefcase and held it up, bearing a judge's bright red seal. "Habeas corpus, officer," Sterling said dismissively. "There are severe flaws in the arrest procedure. Mr. Pendleton was denied access to counsel at the time of booking, and the magistrate who signed the initial hold recused himself from all criminal matters a week ago due to a medical leave. This is a procedural disaster, Sergeant. Unless you want a massive civil rights lawsuit on your hands tomorrow morning, I suggest you process his release immediately." The guard blinked, looking at the document, and then at the imposing attorney. He knew he was entirely outmatched. This was far above his pay grade. He muttered something under his breath and stepped aside. "Let's move, Pendleton." I walked out of the cell without looking back at the guard. I looked over at Jack Miller. He raised a hand, silently wishing me luck. I nodded back, making a silent vow to myself that the moment this was over, I would put money into his commissary account. I followed Sterling down the long hallway, past the booking desk, where the sleepy officers could only stare, and finally stepped through the main doors, greeted by the cool morning air. The rain had stopped, and the city was incredibly quiet. Sterling walked me over to a black sedan parked at the curb. He opened the rear door. "Mr. Collins expects you to keep your end of the bargain," he said coldly. "Tell Richard I always deliver on my word," I replied. That was true. I wouldn't expose those fabricated financial sheets. But my reckoning with Richard Collins wasn't finished yet. I didn't get into the car. "Where are you going?" Sterling asked, knitting his brows. "I have a son to save," I told him, "and I sure as hell don't need a ride from the man who almost helped frame him." I turned and stepped into the humid darkness, a free man with a contraband phone in my pocket. Friday morning's court hearing was less than 24 hours away. The bluff had worked, but the real war was just beginning. I needed to get the official toxicology report from Frank, and then I was going to crash a legal funeral a killer had prepared for the innocent. As I pushed my aging legs forward, a sudden wave of renewed strength washed over me. The entire feel of the city had changed. It was no longer a cage trapping me. It was a hunting ground, and for the first time in days, I wasn't the prey. I was the hunter. Elena thought she had won. She probably thought I was curled up weeping in a holding cell while she slept soundly in my son's house, dreaming of inheriting tens of millions. She had absolutely no idea I was closing in on her. This time I wasn't showing up with a warning. I was coming for total exposure. The city was still sleeping, but I was wide awake, my veins pumping a volatile mixture of caffeine and pure cold fury. I stayed away from my ranch, knowing it would be the first place they monitored. Walking 3 blocks to a 24-hour diner, I grabbed a black coffee and used a payphone out back to call a cab. The jailhouse phone remained tucked away in my pocket. I needed to save every drop of its battery for the final blow. The cab dropped me off a block from Frank's lab. It was 4 a.m. The building was completely dark, but I knew Frank practically lived there. I walked up to the rear entrance and knocked 3 times, paused, and knocked twice. It was our old code. A moment later, the door cracked open, and Frank's exhausted face appeared. He didn't ask a single question. He just pulled me inside and handed me a sealed manila envelope. "It's all in here, Arthur," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "The spectral analysis is ironclad. The digoxin levels in the hair sample prove chronic exposure over the last 3 months. I also detected microscopic trace amounts of a stabilizing compound found in commercial-grade botanical solutions. This wasn't an accidental mix-up. This was a slow-motion murder plot." I took the envelope, feeling its weight. It felt as light as a feather, yet it held the absolute power to dismantle those monsters. "Thank you, Frank," I said, squeezing his shoulder hard. "Go get some sleep. You never saw me tonight." He nodded and locked the door behind me. I had the undeniable scientific proof. Now I just needed a voice. For the next 3 hours, I sat on a park bench directly across from St. Stephen's, the private school Lily attended. I watched the sun slowly rise over the wet asphalt. I was shivering, starving, and dressed in rumpled clothes, looking like a vagrant, but my mind was razor sharp. At 7:30 a.m., the first wave of school buses and private cars began to arrive. I spotted the familiar silver Range Rover pulling up to the curb. But Elena wasn't driving. It was a hired chauffeur. She was likely too busy preparing for her grand triumph in court to bother dropping her own daughter off. I watched Lily step out of the vehicle. She looked incredibly small, her posture weighed down by a heavy backpack. Her head stayed low, refusing to look at anyone as she walked straight toward the gates. I waited until the chauffeur pulled away, then made my move. I walked up to the perimeter fence near the bicycle racks, knowing that was where Lily usually waited for the morning bell. "Lily," I called out in a low, sharp whisper. She spun around, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Grandpa!" She ran over to the fence, pressing her slender fingers through the chain-link grid. "I thought you were in jail. Mom told me you had a breakdown and tried to hurt her." "She's lying, Lily," I said, keeping my tone perfectly calm. "Listen to me. Did you do what I asked on the note?" Lily darted her eyes around anxiously, then reached deep into her pocket and pulled out a heavy metal keychain bearing a Ferrari logo. It looked like a regular accessory, but it was actually a highly advanced, voice-activated digital recorder. I had given it to her for her birthday last year, jokingly calling it a top-secret spy gadget for a game. I never imagined that game would become a literal lifeline. "I hid it right underneath Dad's wheelchair yesterday morning," Lily whispered, sliding it through a gap in the fence. "Just like your note said. Mom was yelling at him last night. I turned the recording function on before I went to bed and grabbed it this morning before she woke up. Grandpa, is Dad going to be okay?" I gripped the keychain tightly. "He's going to be fine, Lily, because you just saved your father's life. Now go to class and act completely normal. I'll see you very soon." She nodded, her eyes welling with tears, and turned to sprint toward the main building. Watching her run, a profound wave of pride hit my chest. She was braver than almost any adult I had ever encountered. I walked back to the cab I had kept waiting. "Drive," I told the operator. "Just keep moving around the city." Sitting in the back seat, my hands trembled as I unscrewed the metal cap of the keychain, revealing a micro USB connector. I plugged it into a mobile adapter I had just purchased at a roadside electronics store and linked it to the contraband phone. I slipped the headphones on and pressed play. The first few minutes were nothing but the muffled rustle of fabric. Then the heavy click of a door opening echoed through the line. "David, honey, are you awake?" It was Elena. Her voice had shed the sweet, doting tone she used in public. It sounded completely cold and dismissive. Silence followed, then a weak, strained moan. It was my son. "Drink this," Elena commanded. "Hurry up. Marcus said we need to make sure your stability index stays elevated before the hearing." "I don't want it." David's voice was slurred, barely intelligible. "It's too bitter. Stop acting like a child, David. It's just a new vitamin blend. Drink it." I heard the sound of liquid being swallowed, followed by a violent fit of coughing. "Good boy," Elena said with a chillingly casual tone. "You know, I was looking at travel brochures earlier today. Hawaii is beautiful this time of year. I think I'll take a trip to clear my head after the funeral. Maybe I'll bring Marcus along. He really has been incredibly helpful through all of this, hasn't he? What, what funeral? David mumbled, his confusion palpable. Your funeral, sweetheart, Elena replied, as effortlessly as if she were discussing the weather. Oh, don't look so shocked. You were supposed to be gone months ago. Your liver is shot and your kidneys are failing. The doctors are calling it an absolute tragedy. A brilliant business mind destroyed by substance abuse. It's a compelling narrative, David. People absolutely love a tragic downfall. The substances? David's voice was gasping, fading out. I never touched anything. Who would ever believe you? Elena laughed softly. You can't even hold a spoon. And your poor father, Arthur? He wanted to help you, but he's just too old and confused. He's currently locked away in a holding cell. Nobody is coming to save you, David. Just close your eyes. It'll all be over very soon. The audio cut out with the sharp, definitive click of a closing door. I pulled the headphones out. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They locked into tight fists, my fingernails digging deep into my palms. I looked out the window. The city was coming to life. People rushing to their day jobs, completely oblivious to the malice operating right beside them. But I knew, and I finally had the absolute proof. I checked the time. 8:45 a.m. The hearing was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. Driver, my voice sounded like solid iron, get me to the Travis County Probate Court. Step on it and don't stop for the lights. We might be cutting it incredibly close, but I didn't care. I had the forensic report, and I had the recording. I possessed the unadulterated fury of a father who had just listened to a plot against his son's life. Elena thought she was walking into a grand legal coronation. She had no idea she was walking straight into a trap, and I was going to be the one to spring it. A sudden, violent thunderstorm cracked over Austin without warning, unleashing a torrential downpour that threatened to wash all of Travis County straight into the Colorado River. I slammed the cab door shut, thrusting a crumpled $100 bill into the driver's hand. Keep the change, I barked, my mind already racing up the steps of the courthouse. We had been blocked by traffic 3 blocks away. The roads were completely paralyzed, a sea of red brake lights glowing through the blinding rain. I checked my watch. 9:15 a.m. The hearing was in 15 minutes. We can't wait out the gridlock, I said, turning to Lily, who had secretly slipped into the cab when I wasn't looking. She refused to stay behind at school, determined to see this through to the very end. Her young face was pale with nerves, but her eyes held a fierce resolve. We have to run for it, Lily. Ready? Without a second of hesitation, she nodded, tightening her grip on her backpack straps. Ready, Grandpa? We threw the doors open and plunged into the downpour. The freezing rain instantly soaked through my thin jacket and Lily's school uniform. We sprinted down the sidewalk. I was 68 years old, and with every single step, my aching knees screamed in protest. But adrenaline is a powerful drug. Holding tightly to Lily's hand, I navigated through the crowd of people cursing the weather under their umbrellas. I could see the iconic neoclassical stone pillars of the courthouse looming through the gray mist ahead, looking like the gates of judgment itself. Suddenly, a black Cadillac Escalade swerved across the lanes illegally, cutting off our path and splashing a massive wave of muddy water over us. My foot lost traction on the slick concrete, and I went down hard, scraping the skin right off my palms. "Grandpa!" Lily cried out, freezing in her tracks to pull me up. "I'm fine. Keep moving," I growled, struggling to my feet. But then I saw it. The SUV didn't keep driving. The doors flew open, and 2 heavily built men in dark suits stepped out onto the pavement. They weren't looking at the traffic. Their eyes were locked entirely on us. They were private security hired by Marcus. "Run, Lily!" I roared, shoving her toward a narrow alleyway between 2 brick buildings. "Get to the back entrance. Don't stop until you find the judge." Fear flashed across her face, but she bolted anyway, her small shoes splashing through the deep puddles. The 2 men immediately moved to pursue her. "Not a chance!" I bellowed with a ferocity I hadn't felt in 20 years. Spotting a Coca-Cola delivery truck unloading crates right beside me, I summoned every ounce of strength I had left, hoisted a heavy plastic crate filled with glass bottles, and shattered it directly across the path of the 2 guards. The crate shattered against the sidewalk with an explosive sound, sending glass shards and dark brown soda erupting in every direction. One of the men lost his balance entirely, crashing heavily onto the slick pavement. I didn't stick around to watch them recover. I turned and vaulted in the opposite direction of the main street, doing everything in my power to pull their focus away from the alleyway. "Hey, over here!" I shouted, waving my arms wildly like a madman. It worked. The second man turned away from pursuing Lily, his expression twisting into pure rage as he charged straight toward a 68-year-old auditor. I lunged directly into the crowded sidewalk. I needed a miracle, and I needed transport. Spotting a city bus just beginning to pull away from the curb, I threw myself against the glass doors, hammering on them desperately. The driver frowned through the rain, but ultimately engaged the mechanism opening the doors. I stumbled heavily into the vehicle, flashing my expired senior transit pass to the operator. He muttered at me to move toward the back of the bus. I collapsed into a seat, my chest heaving erratically, as rainwater dripped from my nose onto the floorboards. Looking out the window, I spotted the man in the dark suit standing on the curb, glaring furiously as the bus merged seamlessly into traffic. I had evaded him, but I had squandered valuable time. The clock read 9:25 a.m. The bus crawled like a snail through the gridlock, with every red traffic light feeling like a personal mockery of my countdown. Finally, after clearing a block, the heavy stone facade of the courthouse came into view. Before the bus even came to a complete stop, I yanked the pull cord and leaped out. I sprinted up the massive granite steps, my legs feeling entirely like lead. I was completely on my own now. I prayed Lily had made it inside safely. Out of breath, I rushed up to the second floor and reached the exterior doors of Probate Courtroom 2. The heavy oak doors were firmly shut. I reached out for the brass handle. It was locked. "Hearing is closed to the public," a deep voice cut in. I turned around to find a towering bailiff standing with his arms crossed, looking at me with undisguised distaste. My hair was plastered to my forehead, my jacket had torn when I hit the pavement, and I was completely caked in mud, shivering uncontrollably from the cold and absolute physical exhaustion. The bailiff stepped directly into my path, telling me I couldn't enter looking like a vagrant, and instructing me to move along. "I am not a vagrant." I gasped for air, reaching into my pocket to pull out my identification. I told him my name was Arthur Pendleton, and explained that the man inside was my son. I insisted I had vital evidence that needed to be seen, begging him to let me through. The bailiff scoffed at me, stating that the judge had given strict orders that this was a closed hearing with absolutely no interruptions. He added that they had already received an alert regarding an unstable individual who might try to disrupt the proceedings. Elena. She had calculated every single move. She had contacted the authorities in advance, shaping the perception that I was unstable before I could even set foot in the building. "Please," my voice cracked with sheer desperation. I told him my son was running out of time and being systematically poisoned, asserting that if I didn't get through those doors, he wouldn't survive the weekend. The bailiff took a step closer, his hand settling on the taser at his hip. He warned me to clear the area immediately, or he would place me under arrest for criminal trespass and disrupting court proceedings. I stared at the heavy oak doors, imagining exactly what was unfolding on the other side. Elena would be shedding her false tears. Marcus would be presenting the fraudulent trust agreements and forged medical evaluations, and the judge would be nodding sympathetically, preparing to sign David's life away. I was standing mere inches from saving him, completely blocked by a uniform just doing his job. I didn't possess the physical strength to fight him, and I completely lacked the time to argue. I looked around desperately, searching for an open window or a side entrance. Right then, a sharp voice cut through the corridor. "Let him pass." The bailiff turned his head, and I spun around. Standing just beyond the security checkpoint was Lily. She was completely drenched and shivering from the cold, but she was holding tightly to the hand of a woman dressed in a sharp, dark gray business suit. "That's my grandfather," Lily announced, her voice echoing clearly down the quiet hallway. "And I am her legal counsel," the woman stated, stepping forward. She was tall, carrying an incredibly commanding presence, and she locked her eyes onto the bailiff with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. The woman flashed her credentials, identifying herself as Patricia Vance, a senior litigator for the Travis County Department of Family and Protective Services. She announced she was there to represent the legal interests of Lily Pendleton, the minor daughter of the individual under review, adding that she was also appearing on behalf of Mr. Arthur Pendleton, who carried emergency exculpatory evidence directly involving the physical safety of David Pendleton. She demanded that he open the door immediately. The bailiff hesitated. The Vance name carried immense weight within the Austin legal system. He looked at the polished, intimidating attorney, then at a drenched, shivering old man, and finally down at the little girl standing in a puddle on the marble floor. He knew this was far above his jurisdiction. Letting out a heavy sigh, he swiped his security card against the reader. The lock disengaged with a sharp mechanical click. I threw the heavy doors open, the warm air of the courtroom rushing over my face. My knees gave out, and I fell to the floor, wrapping Lily in a tight embrace and burying my face against her wet shoulder. "You did it," I whispered, my voice breaking. "We only have 2 minutes, Grandpa," Lily said, pulling back slightly. "The judge is about to finalize the paperwork." I hauled myself up, wiping the rain and tears from my face, and looked over at the attorney. "Let's go expose these monsters," I said. We strode toward the inner bar of the courtroom, leaving a trail of muddy footprints across the polished marble. I looked absolutely terrible and felt entirely exhausted, but I had never felt more capable in my entire life. Beyond those inner doors lay a mountain of deception, and I was about to kick them wide open with the truth. The heavy oak doors of Probate Courtroom 2 swung open with a low, resonant groan that sounded almost like thunder. The warm air inside smelled of floor wax and old paper, contrasting sharply with the cold rain dripping from my clothes. I stepped across the threshold, and for a split second, time seemed to stand still. It was a perfect snapshot of a crime about to be legalized. At the front of the room, Judge Harrison, a man known for his rigid adherence to procedure, held a pen, looking down at the final guardianship order that would grant Elena complete control over David's health care and multi-million-dollar assets. To his right stood Elena, wearing a modest, high-collared black dress, her head tilted slightly downward as she played the part of a heartbroken wife forced to make a devastating decision. Beside her, Marcus Vance stood with his hands neatly behind his back, looking every bit the dignified professional estate protector. They were seconds away from victory. The tip of the pen hovered just above the signature line. The sound of the doors cutting open shattered the concentration of the entire room, forcing everyone to spin around. The court reporter's fingers froze over her machine, and the armed deputy stationed inside bolted from his chair, his hand instinctively dropping to his duty belt. Elena turned her head. When her eyes fell upon me, drenched, caked in mud, standing there like a vengeful specter returned from the grave, her pupils dilated completely. For a microscopic fraction of a second, I saw absolute panic. It was the raw animal terror of a predator realizing its leg had just snapped into a steel trap. But she was a master of deception. She instantly masked her fear, twisting her face into an expression of pure, terrified victimhood. "Your Honor!" she shrieked, her voice trembling with perfect theatrical precision. "That's him! That's the unstable man I told you about. He must have escaped custody. Please don't let him near me." Marcus stepped directly in front of her, playing the protective guardian. "Deputy, remove this man immediately," he barked loudly. "He is extremely unstable and has a history of violence." Judge Harrison looked over the top of his reading glasses, his brow furrowing deeply at the sudden interruption. "What is the meaning of this? Deputy, clear the courtroom." The deputy strode toward me with a dark expression. I didn't take a step back, and I didn't blink. I felt a small hand squeeze my palm. Lily was standing right beside me, shivering from the cold rain, but holding her posture completely straight. And right next to her, Patricia Vance, the senior litigator we had met in the corridor, stepped forward like an iron shield. "Your Honor," Patricia's voice cut through the tense courtroom like a scalpel, "I am Patricia Vance, representing the Department of Family and Protective Services. I am here on behalf of Lily Pendleton, the minor child of the individual under review, and I am appearing alongside Mr. Arthur Pendleton. He has brought urgent, definitive evidence proving that David Pendleton is facing an active, life-threatening situation. The judge stopped his pen. Ms. Vance was a prominent figure in the Austin legal community. He looked at the formidable attorney, then down at the disheveled old man and the dripping child. "Ms. Vance," the judge warned, his tone grave, "this is a closed proceeding, and Mr. Pendleton has been flagged as a security risk. If you have a motion, you need to file it with the clerk." "We don't have time for the clerk, Your Honor," Patricia fired back, refusing to yield an inch. "By the time the clerk processes the paperwork, David Pendleton will already be gone. We aren't here to ask for a continuance. We are demanding 2 minutes of this court's time to halt an ongoing crime." The weight of her words hung in the air, instantly draining the oxygen from the room. Elena gasped dramatically, pressing her hand directly against her chest. She wailed that this was completely absurd, claiming her husband was fading from a rare neurodegenerative condition while his father was turning the courtroom into a total circus. She begged the judge to sign the order immediately, pleading that she needed to get back to the hospital, to be by her husband's side for his final moments. I let go of Lily's hand and began walking down the central aisle. My soaked leather shoes made a sharp squeaking sound against the floor, but the noise felt incredibly heavy and real in the silent room. I didn't run, and I didn't raise my voice. I moved forward with a slow, deliberate pace, carrying the weight of my entire family's survival on my shoulders. The deputy looked to the bench, waiting for a cue. Judge Harrison kept his eyes locked onto me, studying my face. In that exact moment, he didn't see the unstable, confused individual Elena had described. He saw a seasoned forensic auditor who had tracked down white-collar deception for 35 years, a father backed entirely into a corner. He saw the pure determination he had witnessed countless times on the faces of those fighting for justice throughout his career. The judge raised his hand, signaling the deputy to stand down. "Approach the bench," the judge said calmly. I strode directly past Elena. I could smell the familiar scent of her expensive lavender perfume, the exact fragrance that had been masking the underlying medical crisis in my son's home. She lowered her head and hissed a quiet threat directly into my ear, vowing that I was finished. I ignored her completely, stopping right before the elevated bench. As I reached into my damp jacket pocket, Marcus tensed up, likely assuming I was reaching for a weapon. Instead, I pulled out the manila envelope Frank had given me. The edges were thoroughly soaked from the rain. I placed it firmly onto the polished wooden surface, then pulled the Ferrari keychain out and set it right next to the paperwork. The judge looked down at the wet items with a trace of confusion, asking what this was. "The absolute truth, Your Honor," I replied, keeping my voice raspy but steady. Inside that envelope is a comprehensive analysis completed just hours ago by an independent toxicology laboratory. It proves that my son, David, has absolutely no substances in his system, nor is he suffering from an advanced neurological disease. It provides ironclad proof that over the past 3 months, someone has been systematically administering chronic doses of digoxin, a lethal plant-based derivative, to bring about his end. "He's lying!" Elena erupted, her voice cracking into a piercing shriek. "Those are complete forgeries. He's been fabricating documents all week. He's completely out of his mind." The judge ignored her outbreak entirely. He picked up the report and opened it. I watched his eyes scan the technical data. I saw him freeze when he hit the spiking chemical graph Frank had highlighted in red. His eyebrows shot up instantly. He flipped to the second page, then the third, before checking the signature at the bottom. "This is signed by Dr. Frank Miller," the judge noted, his voice dropping an octave. "I know this specialist. He is the former chief medical examiner for the state. He's an old associate of Arthur's." Elena's composure fractured completely as she took a desperate step forward. "They are colluding to frame me. And as for this," I continued, pointing directly to the keychain, "it is a voice-activated recording device. My granddaughter Lily retrieved it this morning from a concealed spot underneath David's wheelchair." I reached out and pressed the play button on the side. The courtroom fell into dead silence. The only remaining sound was the steady hum of the climate control and the heavy breathing of the people inside. Then Elena's clear, malicious voice echoed off the high ceilings, filling every corner of the room. The audio played her words explicitly. "Your funeral, sweetheart. Oh, don't look so shocked. You were supposed to be gone months ago. Your liver is shot and your kidneys are failing. The doctors are calling it an absolute tragedy. Who would ever believe you? You can't even hold a spoon? And your poor father, Arthur? He wanted to help you, but he's just too old and confused. He's currently locked away in a holding cell. Nobody is coming to save you, David. Just close your eyes. It'll all be over very soon." I kept my eyes fixed on the judge's face. His expression shifted from confusion to sheer shock, before locking into a mask of pure, cold fury. He looked up from the device, his gaze pinning Elena like a searchlight. Elena stopped screaming. She froze entirely, the color draining from her face until she looked exactly like a waxy statue. Her mouth opened and closed, but she couldn't summon a single syllable. All her arrogance and the sophisticated persona she had built over a decade were completely stripped away by the sound of her own voice. Marcus Vance was the first to react. He was a survivor of high-stakes corporate corruption, a quick cockroach who knew exactly when the lights were about to turn on. He began stepping backward quietly, trying to slip toward the side exit, operating under the assumption that no one was watching. "Deputy!" The judge's roar echoed through the room like a hammer blow. "Secure the doors! Nobody leaves this courtroom." Marcus broke into a sprint. Abandoning every shred of his polished professional dignity, he shoved past the court reporter, flipping her equipment stand over, and lunged desperately for the main exit. But the deputy was far quicker. He launched himself down the center aisle, tackling the high-end financial advisor directly over the wooden gallery benches. Marcus let out a sharp cry as his expensive suit tore against the wood, his gold-rimmed glasses shattering on the floor. Elena was left standing entirely alone. She looked over at Marcus struggling on the floor, then up at the bench, before fixing her gaze directly on me. There wasn't an ounce of regret in her eyes, only pure, unadulterated malice. She pointed a trembling finger at me, shrieking that it was a deepfake, claiming it was entirely AI-generated and constructed on a computer, asserting that I couldn't prove it was her voice. Judge Harrison stood up abruptly, his towering frame casting a shadow over the bench like an avenging angel. "Mrs. Pendleton," the judge's voice dropped to a chilling, authoritative whisper, "I strongly advise you to stop speaking." He turned directly to the deputy, who was currently latching handcuffs onto Marcus. "Place Mr. Vance into immediate custody," the judge commanded. "Get the district attorney's office on the line right now. Inform them I want emergency warrants issued for attempted murder, conspiracy, and grand financial fraud, and place Mrs. Pendleton under arrest immediately." Hearing the commotion, 2 more armed bailiffs burst through the main doors, instantly grabbing Elena by her arms. She began fighting back wildly, kicking and screaming as her carefully constructed mask shattered into absolute pieces. She screamed hysterically that they couldn't do this to her, yelling that she was the victim, that she was his wife, and that she held full legal rights. "You have the right to remain silent," I said calmly, watching them restrain her. "I highly suggest you start using it." The judge looked down at me, taking in the trail of mud I had left across his courtroom, and the deep exhaustion etched into my face. Then he did something I had never seen a magistrate do. He offered a slow, deeply respectful nod. "Mr. Pendleton," he stated clearly, "this court is indebted to you. I am officially issuing an emergency mandate revoking every legal authorization held by Elena Pendleton and transferring total, immediate temporary guardianship of David Pendleton to you. I am also assigning law enforcement to escort you to your son's residence to ensure his immediate transfer to a secure medical facility." I felt my knees buckle slightly. It wasn't from weakness, but from the sudden, overwhelming wave of relief. The adrenaline that had kept me moving for 48 straight hours vanished instantly, leaving me shivering. I had to grip the edge of the wooden bar tightly just to keep my balance. "Thank you, Your Honor," I murmured softly. I turned around. Lily was still standing next to Patricia Vance, staring blankly at the spot where her mother had just been arrested. She looked so young and incredibly fragile. I walked over, my joints aching, and dropped to one knee, gently taking her face in my hands. "It's over, Lily," I said gently. We did it. Your dad is safe. She threw herself into my arms, locking her hands behind my neck and burying her face in my damp jacket. She began to cry uncontrollably, a deep, chest-heaving release of the terror she had been carrying alone for weeks. I held her tight, looking back at the heavy doors of the courtroom. The nightmare was finally finished. The storm outside had cleared. The rain was still falling, but the heavy atmosphere inside the building had turned incredibly light. I had walked into this courthouse as a fugitive, a suspect, and a labeled madman. But I was walking out as a father who had just taken his family back. Patricia Vance placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "My vehicle is right out front, Arthur," she said softly. "Let's go bring your son home." I stood up, taking Lily by the hand. We walked out of the courtroom, passing the stunned clerks and curious onlookers lining the hallway. I didn't look back at the wreckage we left behind. My focus was entirely forward, heading to the hospital, getting the antidote, and settling in for the long road to recovery ahead. But for the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of what was coming next, because I knew that whatever happened, we would face it together. The Pendleton men are survivors, and we had just won our war. The absolute chaos that erupted inside that room was the most bizarre display of legal theater I had witnessed in all my decades of dealing with the court system. It wasn't a dignified hand of justice. It looked exactly like rats turning on each other to survive as the ship went down. Elena, who only minutes before had been looking down on everyone with cold arrogance, was unraveling right before my eyes. The face she had spent months carefully crafting into the image of a grieving, devoted wife, twisted into a grimace of pure, naked panic. She lunged violently at the deputy holding Marcus down, not to pull him away, but to rip her nails across his face. She shrieked, her voice splintering into a jagged cry that bounced off the courtroom walls, screaming that he made her do it. She wailed that he told her David was in agony and that the medication would help him sleep, claiming she had no idea it was toxic. She kept crying out that she was just a clueless wife who trusted a professional advisor, begging the judge to believe that Marcus had manipulated her and threatened to harm Lily if she didn't sign the property transfer checks. Marcus, pinned hard against the floor by the deputy's knee, struggled to lift his head. His designer glasses were gone, and his nose was bleeding where it had hit the floor, but he summoned every remaining ounce of energy to roar back at her. Spitting blood onto the carpet, Marcus snarled that she was a lying snake, shouting that she was the one who approached him at a charity gala, demanding something that wouldn't leave a trace. He yelled that she couldn't wait for a natural passing, and that using the digoxin was entirely her plan. He barked that she placed the order and paid for it, adding that he had backed up every single email on a secure server she knew nothing about, because he knew she would try to pin it on him the moment things went south. Judge Harrison watched the spectacle unfold with an expression of profound disgust. He didn't bang his gavel, and he didn't call for order. He simply let them tear each other apart. Every word they uttered was effectively a confession, sealing their own fates under the law. The judge finally spoke, his voice cutting through their screaming match like ice. He told them both they were repulsive, stating flatly that they would be spending a very, very long time behind bars. Watching them turn on each other, tearing their alliance to shreds in a matter of seconds, was pitiful, but it wasn't enough for me. I needed her to look at me. I needed her to understand with absolute clarity exactly why she had lost. I stepped forward. The deputies who were preparing to secure the handcuffs on Elena paused when they saw me approach. Seeing the steady fire in my eyes, they silently stepped back a half step, giving me room. Elena stopped screaming. Her chest heaved heavily as she panted, staring up at me. Her hair was completely wild, and her mascara had smeared, leaving 2 dark trails down her cheeks. She looked incredibly small, like a child caught with her hand inside a cookie jar. Except the jar she had reached into was my son's life. Elena immediately shifted her strategy, trying to summon the ghost of the sweet, doting daughter-in-law she had pretended to be for a decade. She began to whimper, pleading with me, telling me that I knew who she really was, reminding me of Christmases we shared and dinners she hosted, crying that we were family and begging me to tell the court she would never harm David. I stood directly in front of her, close enough to see the panic in her eyes and smell the sour scent of sheer terror radiating from her. I didn't raise my hand and I didn't raise my voice. I kept my hands tucked calmly inside my jacket pockets, locking my gaze straight into hers. "You're not family," I said, my voice low and completely steady. "You're a parasite. You looked at my son and didn't see a husband. You saw a walking bank account. You looked at my granddaughter and didn't see a child to protect. You saw a pawn to be used." Elena flinched back slightly, as if the words had physically struck her. She lied again, stammering that she loved him, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit that simply wasn't there. "Be quiet!" I cut her off sharply. "Save your breath. You made a fatal error, Elena. You truly believed you were the smartest person in the room. You thought, because I am 68, I was invisible. You thought I was weak, someone who could be handled with a fake smile and a glass of wine." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a whisper meant only for her. "But you forgot who I am. You forgot that before I was a grandfather making a little girl laugh, I made a living by putting people like you behind bars. For 35 years, I looked grifters, thieves, and corporate predators dead in the eye every single day. I've dismantled white-collar criminals 100 times smarter, 1,000 times more cautious, and 10,000 times more dangerous than you. You thought you were playing a game with a desperate old man, but you were facing a father, and you severely underestimated exactly what a father will do to save his child." Elena stared at me blankly, her mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. The truth finally sank in completely. This wasn't a stroke of bad luck, and it wasn't a coincidence. It was me. I had systematically dismantled her perfect plot with my own 2 hands. I took a step back and gave the officers a firm nod, telling them to take her away. "No!" Elena let out a piercing shriek as the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked tightly around her wrists. "No! You can't do this to me! The money, the property, it's mine! I earned it!" She was still screaming about her lost wealth as they dragged her through the heavy double doors. She didn't ask about David. She didn't look at Lily. She cared only about the fortune slipping through her fingers. I turned my back. She no longer mattered. She was just a nightmare that was finally over. A sheriff's deputy stepped up to me, holding the official order from the judge. He informed me that the escort transport was ready and an ambulance had been dispatched to my son's house, adding that if we wanted to get him to the trauma center at Del Seaton Medical Center before the antidote window closed, we needed to leave immediately. I nodded firmly. "Let's go." The drive to David's house was a blur of flashing emergency lights and the steady wail of sirens. I sat in the passenger seat of the cruiser, with Lily pressed tightly against my side, her tiny hand gripping mine so hard her knuckles turned white. We didn't exchange a word. We just watched the city fly past the windows. When we pulled up to the estate, the house felt entirely different. It was no longer a prison keeping my son captive. It had been transformed into a fully cordoned-off crime scene. The emergency medical team was already there, rushing through the front entrance with a stretcher. Ignoring the ache in my joints, I ran in right behind them. We found him in the living room, slumped in his wheelchair exactly where I had left him, but he was breathing. The breaths were shallow and rapid, but he was alive. "Daddy!" Lily cried out, rushing to his side. David opened his eyes. His gaze was unfocused, clouded by the lingering effects of the toxin, but he saw us. He tried to lift his hand, but it fell weakly back against his lap. Lily sobbed softly, clutching his cold, lifeless hand, telling him it was over and that Grandpa had fixed everything, reassuring him that the people who hurt him were gone. The medical team worked with fluid precision, checking his vitals and starting an intravenous line right there on the living room floor. One of the paramedics called out that his pulse was incredibly weak, shouting that they needed to load him up and move out immediately. I watched them lift my son onto the gurney. He looked so fragile. My tall, strong son, the boy who used to lift me onto his shoulders when he was younger, was down to skin and bones, but he had survived. I climbed into the back of the ambulance right beside him. Sitting by his head, I gently brushed his hair back, just like I used to do when he had a high fever as a young boy. "Hang on, David." I whispered to him as the ambulance doors slammed shut and the engine roared to life. "Just hold on. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." The sirens began to wail again, but this time it didn't sound like an alarm. It sounded like a victory cry. We were still racing against the clock, but for the first time in months, I knew with absolute certainty that we were going to win. Elena was in chains, Marcus was completely ruined, and my son was coming home. Exactly 6 months have passed since the gavel fell in that courtroom. The torrential rain that seemed ready to submerge Austin back then eventually gave way to a brilliant, golden Texas summer. Right now, I am sitting on a wooden bench in Zilker Park, feeling the gentle warmth of the afternoon sun. I am watching a bright red kite dance across the clear blue sky. Holding the string is Lily. She is running across the open grass, her bright laughter drifting on the breeze, a sound so pure it makes my chest ache in the best possible way. She is no longer the girl shivering under the dining table, nor the terrified child passing me secret notes in the dark. She is back to being a 13-year-old girl, completely free and unburdened. The heavy weight she carried has been replaced by the simple joy of a summer afternoon. Sitting right beside me in his wheelchair is David. He is enthusiastically devouring a plate of ribs from Franklin Barbecue, using a napkin to wipe the sauce from his face. The deathly pale color that clung to him for months has completely vanished, replaced by a healthy, sun-kissed glow. He has gained a solid 20 pounds. His hair, the very strands I had sealed in a plastic bag as forensic evidence, has grown back thick and dark. He isn't fully recovered yet. The digoxin took a heavy toll on his nervous system, leaving his legs weak and unsteady. But the doctors assure us that with steady physical therapy, he will be back on his feet and walking by Christmas. Right now, he's back to about 80% of his old strength. But in my heart, he was 100% my son again. His mind was sharp, and his signature sense of humor had returned. The chemical fog had completely vanished, and the resilient man I raised, the one who built a business empire from nothing, was finally back. We rarely talk about those two anymore. We try not to let their names pollute the air of our new life. But today, David was the one who brought it up. He wanted to know the final outcome of the case. I didn't hold anything back. I told him the story exactly as it happened. Elena will never see the outside of a prison cell again. It took the jury less than 2 hours to convict her of first-degree attempted murder, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The judge showed zero leniency, calling her actions betrayal of the highest order. When her life sentence without parole was read aloud, she screamed hysterically, throwing the blame on everyone but herself until the heavy steel doors shut out the rest of her life for good. Every asset she tried to steal was fully recovered and placed into an irrevocable trust, with Lily as the sole beneficiary. As for Marcus Vance, even before the criminal trial began, he was permanently stripped of his financial licenses. To avoid spending the rest of his life behind bars, he accepted a plea deal, turning completely on Elena at the very last second. But he still received a 20-year sentence. Even if he survives long enough to walk out of there, he will be a fragile, broken old man. "They're gone, David," I told him quietly. "Completely erased. Right now, they're just ghosts locked inside concrete boxes, and they will never, ever be able to hurt anyone again." David reached out and gripped my hand. His hold was firm. The violent, uncontrollable tremors that had wrecked his body were completely gone. "Thank you, Dad." His voice cracked slightly with emotion. "You gave me a second chance at life. I thought I would never be able to trust another human being again, but you showed me what it means to truly never give up." I squeezed his hand back, fighting the lump forming in my throat. "I didn't do it alone," I said, nodding toward Lily, who was currently fighting the breeze, trying to keep her kite steady against the shifting wind. "We did this together. We're all survivors. You fought for your life in that dark bunker. Lily conquered her own terror to hand the truth to me, and I just did what any father is supposed to do. I refused to accept a fraudulent balance sheet." I sat there watching the sun begin its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the clouds in a breathtaking display of deep purples and vibrant oranges. The park was slowly filling up with families, mothers pushing strollers, fathers tossing frisbees. Watching them, a profound sense of peace washed over me. I thought about everything I had lost and everything I had clawed back. I used to think my life story was already written. I thought I was just another retired old man waiting out his days, entirely invisible to the world. But this war, this brutal, beautiful war to save my family, taught me a profound lesson. It taught me that growing older doesn't make you useless. It gives you experience. It gives you the ability to spot the cracks where others see a smooth surface. I looked at David and then at Lily. They are my real legacy. Not the numbers in a bank account, not the property deeds, and not the commendations from the audit bureau. Just them. In that exact moment, I realized that family isn't defined by bloodlines or marriage certificates. It isn't determined by who sits at your dinner table or who shares your last name. Family is made of the people who will run straight into a burning building for you when the rest of the world turns its back. Family is the person who notices when you're starting to fade, when your light is growing dim. Family is the person who will kick down courtroom doors, bluff billionaires, and run through a torrential downpour just to make sure you keep breathing. Being family means showing up when it is completely inconvenient. It means listening for the truth when everyone else is shouting over it. It means drawing a line in the sand and fighting to the absolute end when everyone else has thrown down their weapons. I stood up and unlocked the brakes on David's wheelchair. The metal gave a sharp, definitive click, sounding like a final gavel strike. "Ready to head out, son?" I asked. David looked up at me and smiled. It was a genuine, deep smile that reached all the way to his eyes, creasing the corners in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Yeah, Dad," he said. "Let's go home." I called out to Lily. She came running over, her face flushed with joy, winding in her string until the kite became a bright splash of red in her hands. The three of us walked together down the stone path, heading straight into the sunset. My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 68 years old. My back aches more often than not, and my bank account is a bit lighter than it was last year. But as I wheel my son toward my truck, with my granddaughter skipping right alongside us, I know with absolute certainty that I am the wealthiest man alive. I protected my pack. I looked directly into the dark, and I won. And that is everything a father could ever ask for. As we reached the truck, Lily tugged gently on my sleeve, signaling me to stop. She looked up at me with an intense seriousness in her expression, a look that painfully reminded me of myself 40 years ago. "Grandpa," she asked in a quiet voice, "how did you know? How did you notice the soil on that man's boot? When everyone else believed them, how did you know they were lying?" I looked over at David. He was watching us, a proud smile on his face, giving me a slow nod as if granting his permission. It was a heavy question for a 13-year-old girl. I didn't want Lily to grow up carrying my cynicism, searching for shadows in every corner. I didn't want her looking at the world and seeing only the fractures in human nature. But I also knew with absolute certainty that I wouldn't be around forever to check her locks or audit the fine print on her contracts. I knelt down, ignoring the sharp pop in my knees, until I was looking her dead in the eye. "It's not magic, Lily," I told her softly. "It's about looking closer. Most people only see what they want to see. They see the smile on a mask, but they miss the ice in the eyes. They hear the promise on the lips, but they miss the hesitation in the voice. To find the truth, you have to be willing to look at the details that make you uncomfortable. You have to learn to audit life." Lily processed the words, her brow knitting tightly. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "I don't ever want to be fooled again. I want to be able to protect Dad, too." That line, "I want to be able to protect Dad, too," shattered my defenses more than any physical blow ever could. She wasn't asking for a toy. She was demanding a suit of armor. I placed my hand firmly on her shoulder, feeling the strong, steady frame of a girl forced to grow up far too fast. "All right," I said, keeping my emotions in check, my voice a bit raspy. "First lesson starts tomorrow. But you must remember, we use this ability to protect, never to control. We use it to find the light, not to obsess over the dark. Deal?" "Deal," she replied, shaking my hand with a grip that was growing stronger by the day. The three of us piled into the cab. As I cranked the ignition, I looked in the rearview mirror. I didn't see a recovering victim and a frightened child anymore. I saw a team. In that moment, I realized my job wasn't finished. Yes, I saved their lives, but now I had a new mission. I had to teach them how to ensure that no one could ever take this renewed life away from them again. This story is a stark reminder for every single one of us. Always trust your instincts. We often dismiss that tiny voice in the back of our minds, telling us that something is wrong, especially when it involves the people we love. We assume that professionals are always right, and we assume that the people sharing our lives always have our best interests at heart. But blind trust can be fatal. Arthur didn't save his son because he had superpowers. He saved him because he paid attention. He noticed the trembling hands. He noticed the terror in his granddaughter's eyes. And he noticed the limestone dust on a boot. Love isn't just a feeling. It's an active verb, and it requires vigilance. If you notice something in your family that doesn't feel right, don't be afraid to question it. Don't be afraid to be the difficult person in the room. Because sometimes being difficult is the only barrier standing between the people you love and a complete tragedy. Your intuition is your most powerful weapon. Use it. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat and reminded you of the absolute power of a father's love, please subscribe and turn on notifications. I have many more stories of justice, survival, and uncovering hidden realities to share with you. I want to hear from you too. Have you ever had a gut feeling that saved you or someone you care about? Let me know your story in the comments below, because I read every single one. Thank you for listening. Take care of each other out there, and I will see you in the next story.